And it's also early where Alex is, so. So you guys can get started whenever you'd like.
Great. Well, happy Friday, Alex. For those that don't or are not familiar with Alex Blanton, he has been collaborating with me at the CR for many, many years now, actually, which seems a little scary, actually. It's longer than I would like to believe. I am old, but I'm really excited to have you on today, Alex, because I think you've evolved with the industry and kind of have seen some of the changes, and you have been one of the early people working in internal employee communities and taking kind of an external kind of actually, did you worked in engineering before now, but you have an internal external community now, I think. Is that right?
It's mostly internal still. I've spent most of my time with internal, done a little bit of external stuff around some conferences, but not really strong.
Okay. I think that's where I'm keen off of, because they're conferences. But first, let me start off, like, what have you been up to lately? It's been a while since we've caught up, and what's going on in the machine learning community at Microsoft and or with you personally?
Well, I manage the machine learning community here. It's an internal community, and we have a twice yearly conference. So we had our fall conference in November, mid-November. It was all virtual again. So that was kind of interesting because it was the second all virtual one, and the first one where we planned it all virtual to begin with. So I think it went, I think, a lot better in the fall than it did in the spring. We had our platform work well, and access and functionality is like so important in the online space. And I think that our presenters and our audience were more used to online events than they were in June. So it went really smoothly. I mean, it's really interesting because they're so different in person and online events, and even like the way the scores at the end of the conference work out and all that kind of stuff. It like we have like lower satisfaction but higher likelihood to recommend, which is sort of strange to me a little bit.
Yeah. So did you play a lot with formats of like what you were trying to do online? Because I know that's like some people getting their head around, like, we're not lifting and shifting. We have to think about this differently. It's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, it was really different. I mean, we shortened pretty much everything was shortened. The technical talks were shorter. The tutorials were shorter. And then, in person, it's always someone walks up to a podium and presents, maybe a couple people. But here we had live sessions. We had pre-recorded sessions. We had content we curated and invited the researchers. It was out on YouTube already. We just replayed at the conference and the researchers were there. We did some sessions that were live at a time better for people in Europe and India. And then sometimes we replayed that in Redmond. Sometimes they presented again live in Redmond. Sometimes we only presented it in those time zones. So a lot more complexity in planning the program. And we also built in a lot of for our conference, we built in blank space in the day more than you would in an in-person, where you wouldn't just have the whole venue not have something happen, right?
It's interesting because I was kind of an observer of our team, and Shannon, who's here lurking, did a fantastic job of mixing up formats and taking what was a 2-day event and stretching it over a month, just to accommodate the fact that it's very hard to sit on Zoom for 7 hours and do anything. And some of the things that I was really intrigued by were some of the non-presentation things. So we had little yoga sessions and little journaling sessions and or shared experiences. And I think it's it's one of those things that it's just like, it's a different pro and con set, right? Like you can't have the same authenticity and energy and all of that, but you can invite more people in, you can do more things, you can mix up the formats more, like, and then it's more complicated on the back end because you have a lot more going on, and it runs over a longer period of time, and so it's yeah. So I don't know which is better, but it's interesting that, like, what I feel like the biggest positive to come out of it, that kind of experience for everybody, is that I really think it shattered the ambivalence to get online to do something, right? Like, regardless of what it is, like, everybody just had to. And so now, like, it's not weird when we say, hey, we're going to have an online whatever. I had an online bridal shower for a friend. Like,
right. It's happening.
It is. And everybody could come, which was awesome, right? Like, if we had done that in person, it would have been much smaller. So that's interesting. I'd like to.
One of the other things that I think was, so because you mentioned like yoga and stuff, and our audience, we tried some of that in the spring, and for our audience, like in the middle of the workday and it's all internal, it didn't play as well. But one thing that happened that was really interesting in this fall conference was right as it ended, one of the attendees emailed me and he said, this was on the Friday of the event. So the event was actually still going on. He said, hey, a couple of the presenters early in the week recommended a couple of books. And I really wish that all the presenters had done that. And so I said, well, why don't we just make that request now? Because we have this Teams environment. So we just created a channel. And I said, hey, this attendee, he's interested in books. Presenters, attendees, do you have book recommendations? And we got this enormous thread that went on, for like a week and a half after the event. So also, like, the event was over, but it wasn't quite over. So I thought that was interesting as well.
It is interesting. And that's another pro, right? We did that at our event. People had some issues they wanted to talk to an expert about. And because we were running it for a month, we could schedule that and get it up and going. And there were a couple of sessions where people said they wanted to rewatch it later. And because it's a recorded session, we can now have a watch party later and share it with other people. So yeah, there's definitely some amazing benefits that come out of that. Although I think, having been in COVID land for 9 months or whatever it is, I think people really are craving some in-person, like, the vaccine can't come soon enough.
That's true.
For a variety of purposes. I would like to shift gears, because one of the things, and it's related to COVID, that has really pushed the internal community conversation in a way that I haven't seen. It was interesting. We finally split our whole database this year on the research side by internal and external. And I was really surprised how immature the internal use case still was, right? Because we talked to some clients and you and other organizations that are ahead of the curve. And so there's this perception that, people are getting it. But when you look at the research database, that's not actually true. It's very bimodal. There's a small group at the front that are actually engaging employees in a new way. And then everybody else who's like, yeah, we have this intranet with groups.
I see. Yeah.
That, we're not actually working in community. We're occasionally asking a question, but the average question per year was like one question per employee per year, right? And you're like, that's not community, right? Like, you haven't really, but I'm also getting, I'm working on I just started working on a project right now where a huge Fortune 500 company is saying, we're not ever going to go full-time back to the office.
Yeah.
And so the office isn't the community platform anymore. And it's not implicit anymore. We need to be really explicit about where does our culture sit? And you could say you shouldn't have done that 10 years ago because you're an international company. So like if headquarters is where your culture sits, that's problematic to begin with. But people didn't really have to think about it. So they didn't. And so now they're looking at this and saying, what does our ecosystem look like? What do we want our culture to be? Where do we need kind of centers of gravity in terms of information or people or conversations? And I'd just be interested in your perspective on how things have shifted over the, I don't know, it's not quite a decade that you've been kind of working through this.
Mm-hmm. Well, so my community is part of it's a program of communities within the company. There's a small team that's resourced as a program team, and then all of the leads are essentially volunteers or do it as part of their job. And I think that program overall has steadily gotten more mature, but in the last really few months, well, the groundwork for this was set earlier, but the program team has really been driving this, I guess, evolution of the whole program from, like you mentioned, Q&A. Like it was really focused on the use case was Q&A. People have a question and they get it answered, and we're gonna keep that, but also really drive to make the community a place where employees can demonstrate and develop individual technical leadership skills, because you have one path in your career is up through the managerial path, but there's a lot of people like me. I was a manager for a couple of years. Frankly, I just didn't enjoy it that much. There's a lot of people like me, and managing a community is really different, but there's a lot of skills that you have to have to lead a community effectively. Some are probably the same as a manager and some are different. And so they're reconceptualizing what the community is. It's really interesting. Even like the governance approach, all of the communities are being strongly encouraged to go out and recruit executive sponsors and business sponsors. So like executive sponsors are people at the CVP level, and say, hey, we want you to be the exec sponsor here. We want you to engage with the community on a regular basis, not too frequently, and we're going to feed information back to you. And then a business sponsor is someone a little bit closer to the day-to-day activities of the business. And I think that's really interesting, because rather than having the communities sort of exist in their own world where employees kind of opt in just if they're interested, but it has no real connection back to the business except through whatever happenstance comes through individual employee efforts. Like the whole structure is trying to get geared towards integration with key decision makers throughout the company. And that honestly, like that could never have happened 10 years ago, because people weren't even familiar with what the value of community would be.
That is really interesting, because I was just reflecting on this, because when I started the CR, when I was putting together this maturity model and thinking about community as a governance structure, I was really thinking about how it applied at the organizational level, meaning how does it change the whole organization if you operate as a community?
Yeah.
And the market was definitely not ready for that. And so a lot of the work we ended up doing is in these very discrete, not single purpose, but like very defined around the theme communities, which are absolutely part of the ecosystem, but it wasn't that macro look at overall business models and how we structure the organization.
Yeah.
But now I'm seeing that conversation actually get attention, and people are starting to understand that. And when you talk about management, it's interesting, because I think I'm kind of like you, which is I'm not a great traditional manager, because I don't like telling people what to do, and I don't like monitoring work, and I don't like, that's just a level of like, I kind of assume people can manage their own work, right? So that makes me bad at following up, because like I assume they're doing work unless they've told me otherwise. but community management is very different because I'm managing the ecosystem, not the tasks, right? I'm managing the environment. I'm making sure the environment is supportive of people having self-efficacy to be able to do work, self-directed work, right? And so for me, it completely flips the management paradigm on its head a little bit and says, my job as a manager isn't to tell you what to do. It's to make sure that in the process of you working, the barriers are removed and you have the support you need to pursue the work that excites you. And for me, that is the nirvana of the future work, right? Like in knowledge worker situations, I as a manager will never have the expertise that I'm using you and the general you, but like anybody would have as my employee, right? The reason I'd have them as an employee is because they bring different expertise to bear. So that's what excites me, is I can finally see that conversation changing people's mental models about what community is essentially.
Are you even seeing whole organizations kind of change the way they approach their hierarchy and their managerial structure and the roles? Like, or is it more of a kind of a mindset that's occurring, but it hasn't quite made it into the structural aspect of companies?
Yeah, I would say people are now exploring the idea. They haven't necessarily and I'm not sure they necessarily understand the implications on every area of the business, right? Like you have to start changing HR in pretty fundamental ways, right? You have to change kind of the employee progression, career progression in fundamental ways. And so I think that's going to take a long time, because those operational structure things both need a mindset shift, and we need new financial and legal models for what people are agreeing to and how they're not monitored, but how that whole system is measured and understood. So I don't think it's going to be an overnight type of like the CEO says, right? Like, because the CEO has less power than people think the CEO has, right? Because nobody can kind of change your behavior, right? You have to be motivated to change your behavior. But the people at the C level of very large organizations are starting to say, hey, like, yeah, this is a bigger shift than just putting the technology out there. Because that's what we've been trying to do for the last decade. Like, here's the technology, now do this. It hasn't really worked very well. And that was the surprising thing about the internal data this year as well, which is 40% of organizations that were in our survey on the internal side had one or fewer community managers.
Wow.
And like 20% had none, right? No full-time community managers. And you're like, you can't, and you don't have to call them community managers. They're kind of designers. They're cultural designers or even user experience people. But like, if you can't translate how to use the technology into work processes, what your business owners for these communities are doing is like integrating, then you can't actually change work fundamentally.
That's really interesting.
So it's interesting.
Do you think that, like, because while you were talking, I was thinking my particular work group, which is not my team, but the group is only like 75 people. So it's pretty small within the context of the company as a whole, obviously. But like I would say they sort of let you go. You know what you're supposed to do. There's not a lot of micromanaging. it's probably not like that throughout the company. Do you think this is something that can exist in groups around a large company and kind of permeate the culture in some way? Or is it something that ultimately, like you mentioned, at some point HR is going to have models that work for everybody to reframe how people
And I think that's how it's been working, right? Like it's been taking root in these groups in organizations that work a little differently already, right? And
Yeah.
want to work a little differently already, or with people in organizations that want to work differently. And because those groups are already saying, essentially, we have a different mental model of what it means to work together. Like, I don't feel like I need to tell you what to do. Like, I already have the relational model that says it's not up to me to determine everything. It's my job as a senior manager to kind of like set the vision and be like, this is the direction we're all running in. As long as you're running in this direction, you can figure out how to add value there. But I think what's happening is those groups are what are going to demonstrate the value of working in that way, right? And it's really only enabled by the technology, but it reduces a whole cost layer, right? Like that micromanagement is not efficient, right? Like you need extra resources to sit there and monitor what people do.
Right.
And it's those people that are usually the ones that are most threatened by transparency too, because their whole role is to be the conduit of information, right? And so when you don't need that conduit anymore, what does the manager do?
Right.
So I think what's happening now because of COVID is some of those groups are still operating really well. What I've seen just anecdotally on the lift and shift model is it's actually adding to people's work, right? So people are working more. They have no room for relief, and they're home all the time, and they're on Zoom calls 6 to 8 hours a day. And so when do you work? You work after the Zoom calls.
Right.
And you're like, that's insanity. And so I think people are looking at it and being like, there's this group that doesn't do that and they're functioning relatively healthily. And there's these groups that are on Zoom calls all day. What do we do?
I've heard people talk about being on Zoom or Teams all day. I'm so glad that my role or my group or whatever doesn't require that. I'm certainly on there when it's important to have the conversation and the meeting, but having your own individual work time to get tasks done, do thinking about things, planning, that's like so important. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to actually get anything.
And I think that's what's driving this, like, how do we design across channels? And how does the office like what does that channel, what is that channel optimized for? Right. And it's for all this little stuff for which we didn't need Zoom calls because we had the office, which now are being replaced with Zoom calls that keep us from doing work, right? So I think that's what people are starting to see and say, hey, like, this is not tenable going forward. And I was interested by your comment that it's just been recently in the last few months that people at Microsoft are starting to say, hey, this needs to be integrated. Because I think there's like this collective, like there's a collective grief process or I think there's this common pattern to how humans deal with difficulty or strife or whatever. And I think the pattern that I've noticed across organizations is this spring, people were just surviving, right? Like something happened really suddenly. We're just trying to like keep the lights on and make sure what has to be done gets done. The summer, everybody was like, okay, we're we're going to take a deep breath because the kids are out of school. Like,
Yeah.
we're used to being on vacation. Summer's a little decompression. And then people came back to the fall and were like, okay, we've got to start making some decisions around the go forward plan because this isn't going away. We can't operate the way we were in the spring. So how does this work? And so yeah, it was just interesting to get that same confirmation of that's kind of what's going on where you're at as well. Yeah, so I'm really intrigued where we are. I don't know if it's the tipping point, meaning I don't know if we get a vaccine and most companies say, okay, that was fun, but we're going back.
I don't know. I mean, it feels, I just don't, I'm not a epidemiologist or anything like that, but like, it just feels like it's hard to imagine it's going to go back to exactly the way it was, either for health or reasons like where there still has to be some concern for some period of time about getting too many people in one place, or culture. Or I have colleagues who have moved. They have moved to Portugal or Japan, where they're from, and I don't know, they're getting their jobs done. Like, do they need to come back? Is the company going to want them to, like, need them to, like, demand? I don't know. Like, and so it feels like it could be very fundamentally different. I mean, I'm kind of thinking about that in a smaller sense for my community events. It's like, okay, once we can get back together in person, does that mean we really just return to the model we were using through 2019? We probably won't do it like we did in 2020 either. Is it a mix? Is it a hybrid? How do you do that? That's actually one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is how do you kind of mix in person and online even more than we already
You know
were?
what I equate it to? 10, 15 years ago when, or it wasn't 15 quite, but when I started getting on Twitter, I remember the first Enterprise 2.0 conference I went to. And I had been in product marketing, so I had been going to a lot of tech conferences for a while. And I had always been an odd duck, especially when I was in my 20s. I was like hanging out with like people with tie clips in their 60s, men who were like 3 decades older than me, right? And it was awkward. It was always awkward because I was like, I don't, like, once we're done talking about like work stuff, like there's not a lot there. So I went to the Enterprise 2.0 conference, and there were all these people from around the world that I had been interacting with on Twitter. And our first impulse was to hug each other because we had been we had been talking about all this stuff. And over the next few years, it completely changed my conference experience, right? Because I knew I didn't need to use the time to like stuff content into it.
Right.
And conference organizers probably won't be happy to hear this, but I started going to a lot less of the sessions because I was like, I can get the decks online, I can get the recording online, and spending a lot more of my time on all the social hallway conversations, whatever, because those were the things that I couldn't do virtually. And so that's kind of how I see events evolving, which is you're coming together to be together and have the emergent mix-up of what happens.
Yeah, you're really getting my gears moving about what I'm even just imagining the space where we hold the in-person event, and like, maybe there's a lot less content out to an audience, and a lot more, hey, this thing was available. You can watch it the 2 weeks beforehand. And now is a time where like the 5 people on the team are in the room and you can just talk with them, you know? That's really interesting.
Reflect on what we all heard and how does it apply to us? And like, let's have that shared conversation. And I think even down to the conference facilities will change, right? Because in that world where you're not sitting in a ballroom with 500 people or whatever, you want unique spaces. You want spaces that encourage conversation, not these huge channels, like just go into ballroom after ballroom after ballroom. And you want the experience to be memorable. So you want a unique surrounding so that people remember that event for its feeling.
Interesting.
So like, anyways, it's a really interesting time to think about all of these things. And because we're so disrupted, it's the time we can insert things, because you're right, like people are moving. There's a whole, some of our member organizations have taken location off of their job descriptions, right? So they don't care anymore. People are giving up real estate, right? Manhattan, all the city centers are really struggling because, and I was talking to someone in corporate real estate, and they were like, companies are sitting on huge piles of cash because they're not paying leases. And so, and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to redeploy those assets, which is also interesting. I have some ideas, but you know. So that's kind of what I'm, well, I was going to say what I've been thinking about lately, and probably because we're getting to the end of the year, is 2020 a cultural cleanse, right? It bubbled up all this stuff and made all this implicit stuff explicit. And all of us have been struggling with all of that all year. But it allows us to act on a lot of it, right? So like the positive momentum moving forward is, okay, we've surfaced all of this stuff. We understand just how painful and the implications of all of it. But now we have the opportunity to do something about it, which is, it's not a clean slate because there's still a lot of context, but we've got that opportunity.
Interesting, yeah.
So it's similar to the conference thing. How do we reimagine this?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You've been forced into a completely foreign situation now as you return to normality. I don't know. Have you thought about applying the hero's journey to this as we journeyed out into this unknown place and maybe gain new powers and come back and kind of transform the world we were part of before?
That's an interesting question. Because I kind of like the anti-hero's journey, right? Like but it also reminds me of, I was an exchange student in Germany.
Yeah.
And I was there for a year and I came back. And one of the things that they warn you of when you come back is that you have reverse culture shock. Yeah. And you never expect it because you're going back to what you always knew, but you've changed because you now understand this different context. And so you come back and you have all these questions about why is this the way it is? People do this better. Like, why are we doing this? So I think it's going to be somewhat like that, which is we're going to have the opportunity to reorient ourselves in the world that used to exist. And we're going to say commutes, right? Why are we commuting an hour on both sides of our day? It's madness, especially when we don't have enough time to cook dinner, right? Like there are things I could do with those 2 hours a day, right? That matter more than sitting in a car. But on the other side, what we found out about being home all the time is you do need a transition time. So what that commute did for a lot of people is give people that transition time. So we still need that, but we don't need 2 hours of commute, right? So how do we marry the two things now that we know better? Yeah. No, but it's kind of fun.
Commute is a great thought exercise for that too, because it's so many people can relate to it, and it's very concrete, you know. Then you can expand that thinking out to sort of broader, maybe more intangible ideas about work.
So I think what it's going to do too is make a whole set of people really uncomfortable because it changes power dynamics, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're shifting power dynamics, there's a set of people with power that were fine, even if it wasn't perfect, they were fine with the way it was because it meant they kind of knew the scope of power. And so it's going to make the people who had power more uncomfortable than people that never had a lot of power. And that's going to be interesting. I don't know where that's going to go, but like, I think they're the ones that are going to struggle the most coming back to this new world and not being very turned upside down and not really kind of having a good sense of what's going on.
I see.
So, yeah. Well, Alex, it's been fascinating to like chat through that because I think the conference, just like the commute, is a good metaphor for thinking about like, how will we change? Do we want to change? Will we go back to the way things were? And I think, you know, obviously there's going to be a range of solutions to that. Some people will want to go exactly back to where we were before, and some people will change everything.
I know that. I think that as a conference organizer, I think that's one that could be one of the most challenging things, because I do think that some of the audience is going to be like, I liked what we had before. I mean, so sort of just what you were talking about before. There's going to be some people who really want to go exactly to what we had before, but then there's going to be people who are like, hey, the new thing works so much better for me. I want to do that. And how do you balance those and try to figure out the right solution for whatever context, whether it's a conference or the way your office policies are or whatever?
Well, and the answer is nothing is ever perfect for everybody, right? So you're going forward and it's just going to be imperfect for different people.
I mean, I really did like what you were talking about kind of thinking about what was the intent of this gathering and why are we here? What do we need to get out of it? And what is better served in another context? And it sort of makes things more complex because you have like a lot of different ways to interact. I feel like that's exciting for a community manager, right? Because like I'm already used to managing like lots of different kind of threads and ways people access information and other people and kind of tying those together. And I hope trying to provide clear navigation for people and bring clarity to where to go for what. And then you think about, like, you could think of what would be a very complex event kind of, but if you can make it simple for people to figure out where to go to get what they need, and individuals could have very different paths through this experience that sometimes they might meet up, but they're on kind of separate journeys, if you will, through, and that's really interesting to think about. And then the tools that it would take to map that out, plan that, track that, measure that, report on it, all that kind of document it. I was already struggling with how do you document a virtual conference. That's why I was getting really into VR, because you can take these virtual snapshots in VR and you get a better picture of what's going on than, say, taking a screenshot of a massive Zoom call or something like that.
Well, I don't know if you came to Connect, but Priya Parker and The Art of Gathering, she wrote the book, The Art of Gathering. You should go back and look at that.
I didn't get to go to that session.
Yeah. Well, it's recorded because, it was at Connect. That is a great one to look at, or the book to read, because she's really talking about exactly that, which is how do we step back and think about, like, what is the point of this? And do we really need, was that habitual that we did that? Or does that serve a purpose? So I think I'm going to end on that, because this is, we could redesign entire companies on the phone by ourselves. But it's a great kind of brain candy to take into the weekend. So thank you. And good luck with that event planning. And if you want to brainstorm, I'm here for it.
All right. Well, I hope you have a really good rest of your 2020 and see this year through, and then begin 2021 refreshed and renewed, and hopefully with more possibilities ahead of us.
lots of things to do, lots of exciting things, a lot of exciting possibilities, I think. So great.